Hello, I am Shelley Caradwen, and this is Rediscovering Connection. And I'm very excited today to have Mr. Robin Dunbar here with me. Good morning, good afternoon, Robin. How are you today?
Good afternoon, at least here. And I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent. Well, I've got up bright and early here on Vancouver Island to speak with you, and I'm tremendously excited because when I when I found your work, it really was the missing piece in a puzzle that I've been putting together for the last 2 years of my own research and kind of drawing on other people's research. But Dunbar's number, which I think you're famous for, was really that tangible piece that I'm like, wow, all of this work that I've been looking at in terms of kind of frequency that we're spending time with close and kind of our wider spheres of social connections, the numbers in there really makes it clear to me how possible it is, how accessible it is to kind of uplift our lives through close friends. And we don't actually need that many of them. Yeah. And I've been following a guy named Frederick Laloux for a couple of years. He wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations. And one of the pillars of his work is about self-managing teams. And he had come to, but it's between 12 and 15. That's the maximum you can have for a self-managing team.
Yep. No, absolutely right. There is a real crisis point somewhere around about 40, where organizations or groups, work groups, let's say, have to shift from being democratic to having a managing committee.
At 14? Did you say
40?
40?
So
Okay,
it's
yes.
between the 15 layer and the 50 layer that this happens, and it seems to be
You need more structure.
You need more structure to it. You need a management structure, basically, if it's smaller than that. So, sort of in terms of these layers, the 5 and 15 circles police themselves.
So in your opinion, can loneliness, like the trajectory that it's been going on in recent history, can we turn this around?
The answer is yes, but my worry is that our communities are just too big, which means it won't happen easily, naturally. So we have to go out of our way to make it work. And this is really the burden of the latest book I've written, which is a collaboration with a couple of business consultants. We pitched at the implications of these ideas to business organization, which is we really have to get back to, ironically, the old Victorian idea of an organization as a village, as a community. And you have to provide the possibility for people to create a social world at work. Because if they don't have a social world at work, it's going to be very difficult for them to parachute in quickly and simply. And you're going to end up with a lot of loneliness. And that means they're going to take more time off work because they're going to get depressed and they're going to get physical illnesses as a result. And you're putting a lot of pressure on the people they work with to fill in for them while they're off sick. It's not good for anybody. But it's an easy problem to solve with a bit of careful forethought. The problem lies in the careful forethought. I mean, it's very interesting if you look at these big empire builders among the industrialists in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century did. I mean, a lot of them were Quakers anyway, which was a good start because they had this sense of community, as it were. But even the ones that weren't Quakers, so the Cadburys were Quakers, for example, but even people like Lord Leverhulme of the founder of Unilever, as it is now, were very clear that if you didn't create a community out of your workforce, you paid a very heavy price for it. And so they went to great lengths to build sometimes extraordinarily beautiful accommodation for them. These were not kind of Manchester back-to-backs of the early 19th century mill towns. These are houses which now sell for small fortunes, because they're in private hands now on these estates that were built. But all of them, every house looked different. Right? None of these rows and rows of identifiers. Every house looked different. There was a central kind of village hall where the lunches could be put on for old people, or philosophical meetings could be held, to engage people, and sort of games could be played, and there would be libraries and churches and pubs and things. So they thought very carefully about how to create this sense of a community, so that everybody understood that you work for Cadbury's, you work for Unilever, well, Lever Hume as it was then, you were a member of that community and you were committed to it, and they worked hard. That's why they ended up being so successful. Thanks. For sure. So the tendency, in the post-war, from the 1950s, we kind of got carried away with, dare I say it, mostly American sociologists telling us that all people were interested in is working for money, so you work them hard and you get rid of all these facilities. So all these places had tennis clubs and stuff like that. You're talking about the 1930s, when tennis was very fashionable at all levels of society, and they had, there were posh tennis clubs in the suburbs, but there would be tennis clubs, for the workforce, the working families, because it was culturally a popular thing to do, at least in Britain, probably America too. And Mars, I'm sure, were the same. There's another big family institution, which is still a family institution, still run by the family. It has that same sense of creating a community. But there was a strong move away from that. It's the accountants, mostly to blame. It's just, we can't measure what the consequences. We can't measure the input and the output in terms of dollars, so it can't be very interesting. And money is going in, but that's money wasted. Could be spent on expensive business trips for the management instead. And I think that was, or we think that was a big mistake, really. And if they want to have more successful businesses and organizations that survive, because the lifespan of businesses is very short now. We're talking about 10 years as the average length of a FTSE 200 company, or a Dow Jones company now, whereas some of those other successful organizations have been around for well over 100 150 years. If longevity is important, which we think it is, and it should be, then they've got to rethink the investment patterns so that it's not so short term, and rethink how they treat the workforce. They have to view the workforce as part and parcel of the business, not as transient folk that you can kind of throw out tomorrow if you don't need them.
And just going back to the self-managing part of that, like in my previous corporate organization, there wasn't a well-being initiative. So I collaborated with one colleague initially to kind of get it going, and then we found other colleagues that were passionate about employee well-being as well. And we managed to get a bit of budget from HR to do this, but essentially we drove it. And I think thinking about those numbers that can be small, like empowering colleagues to start their own employee resource groups in whatever little niche they want, and then letting them know that, you don't even need that many people. Like, even if you get 2 or 3 people signing up to this little group that you come together every week or every 2 weeks, like that might be all you need for your work social.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, clearly, you have to be very sensitive in identifying what it is that will work as a social environment. Tennis doesn't do it anymore. We have too much cheap
Badminton's
entertainment.
pretty good though. We had a badminton group.
Yeah, well, you've got to see what the local culture is of the time, as it were. Because you're competing against more self-contained family life now than you were 50, 100 years ago. You're competing against television, and you're competing against cheap supermarket alcohol. Right, so you've got to think in terms of what would actually work. What do people want? What would they stay on after work for? And places have done it. So one of the examples we quote in our book is SAB Miller, who are now part of InBev, the big brewing giant. So SAB Miller is South African Breweries, that's the SAB bit, and they amalgamated with or bought out Miller Lite, the American brewer. And when they were set up as SAB Miller from South Africa, right from the start, in all their factories and admin blocks, as it were, campuses, they had a bar. I mean, they produced beer, so they put in a bar in the entrance foyer of effectively every building, and you could just go along. They were open essentially, 5 till 6 every day. Stay open all night or anything. You could go along. People went along, dropped in on their way home, had a beer, chat to people. You met different people from different parts of the organization you wouldn't otherwise have met. And one of my co-authors who worked for SAB Miller in those days said 20 years later, the Facebook groups that were set up out of those bar meetings still going, even though none of these people work for the company anymore. They're scattered all over the universe.
The ties that were formed
exactly
on that regularity of knowing that it's accessible, not that they even had to go there every day, but
that's right.
that they
that if you turned up, you could guarantee there'd be somebody to talk to who'd be interesting. Even if you've never met them before, it would be an interesting hour that you could spend there. So there are things you can do that work. Singing is another very good one. Choirs really work extremely well. We refer to them as the icebreaker effect because they're so effective. But it's really about kind of thinking through, and my pitch on it, we never quite said this in the book because I think my co-authors, who actually do run a very high level consultancy, were a bit nervous about offending too many people.
We'll have the exclusive, Robin. Thank you.
My pitch is that's what HR's job is. It's not regulating, interviews and regulating diversity tick boxes and all this kind of stuff, which they got trapped into, and regulating, sort of the legal aspects of employer-employee things.
Human piece.
It's what they should be doing is devising ways of creating this sense of belonging.
Yes.
And they do a lot better. They do a much better job and be more appreciated.
Yes.
And they wouldn't have so much of the other work to do because people wouldn't be constantly bickering and suing.
And like you mentioned before about, you need the right activities to encourage people to stay on after work.
Yes.
But if you think of the effects, the positive effects of whatever this is in terms of people retention and then sickness, actually, there's no reason that some of these activities shouldn't take place in work time.
Yes, exactly so. Exactly so. And retention is a big one because that's very costly in the current circumstances to most of the big businesses, because you train up people. Most jobs are now quite technical. They require a lot of knowledge of some kind. And you spend all this time training up somebody for the appropriate level, whether it's how the filing system works or whether it's, what the technicalities of our production system are, or whatever it is, and as soon as they're functioning well, they're off, and you've wasted that money.
And I hear it in Canada. A friend said recently, oh, she's coming up to 3 years, which means she has to look around because her current company would never give her the kind of pay rise that she can get if she jumps
right,
ship. She can get a 10 grand pay rise. I'm like, wouldn't they match you? And she's like, no, that's a fault in the system, surely.
Yes, no, it is. Yes, yeah. That's something which needs to be done at the same time, or needs to be thought about at the same time. I mean, there is a sense in which money is not the only thing people work for, but on the other hand, you don't want to treat them as slave labor, right? Give them a pittance and they'll stay. But there is a sense in which people would rather have less money and work in a enjoyable, congenial environment, right? Anytime. And that's certainly, I know when my co-authors have done surveys, and I think also that's come out of some of the big surveys that the various international consultancies have done. Again, people would much rather have 10,000 less and work in a congenial environment that's a pleasure to be at, that you wake up in the morning and can't get to work fast enough, because you enjoy it so much. And again, there is a sense, I mean, that used to be true of things like the BBC. So the BBC notoriously paid considerably less than ITV to its staff. I mean, we were talking about 10 grand less, because they knew people just liked working for the BBC. I mean, that was another aspect of this, in the sense that it's, it's the reputational side. I work for the BBC. Everybody knows the BBC all around the world. And that's parcel of that story. It's a congenial environment for you to, so there's that reputational side, which is important, but equally there's the kind of village community, so there's a word I'm trying to think of here, meaning clubbishness, but comradely or something like that, is often used in these contexts. And it's true, if you get on with the people you work with, you work much more efficiently, not least because they don't have to explain everything to you. You just know it.
You've got that kind of hive mind going between you.
It comes magically from one brain to another without actually having to have it explained, because you think the same way.
Yes, and that can only come, I guess, once you've been working together in that team for a certain number of years.
Yes, indeed so. Yeah. It's like a football team. It's all very well being an absolute genius, but that doesn't win the match.
Yeah, you've got to be working as a team.
You've got to be working as a team.
Do you have any thoughts on the shift to remote working and the necessity to still have some physical touch points with team members?
I do. The issue here to me is twofold. I'm not against remote working, because I work in a context where remote working is extremely common. Let's say academia. So most academics will go into the lab, or they're going to give their lectures to the department or seminars, but often they'll work at home if they want to actually get something done. So the academics are used to this, but I'm very conscious of the fact that, and this seems to be forgotten by everybody in the current enthusiasm for home working, hybrid working, is it's only possible for certain people. And those people tend to be paid more. And there's a whole bunch of people who simply cannot do it. Their job does not allow it. And they're people like the doorkeeper, the person on reception, the person who makes the sandwiches in the canteen, or sweeps the floors, or pulls the lever on the machines, or nurses, or teachers, face-to-face people, and they tend to be paid less.
Mm-hmm.
So the risk is, if you don't think through this very carefully, you end up with a two-class society and considerable envy and dissatisfaction coming up from below, right?
Mm.
Secondarily, it's very clear that, however, it's clear why people want to work from home now that they had the experience of doing so during lockdown and are being allowed to do that, is that it relieves you from the awful commute that you used to have. That's the real thing that people want to get away from. And clearly it's very advantageous. However, there are two interesting observations I'd make here. One is, this is not the first time we've tried this. We tried this in the late 90s. In big cities became very expensive to rent big tower blocks in. So a lot of companies decided that the way to do this was to give everybody a laptop, because laptops had just come in, send them off to their Cotswold cottages, and they could work from home and come in to the office when they needed to. And there's a whole lot of people who set up in consultancies to facilitate this. And the message that they were giving, man, woman, and child, because I was sort of on the periphery of this at the time, was, do not think you can put all the money you save on your rental footprint in the bank. Because if you do, your company will fall apart. And it will fall apart because people working from home face two problems. One is either they will overwork because there's no time to go home at 5 o'clock. They will work through and they'll burn out, or they will just lose focus and engagement with the organization because they won't be seeing anybody. And I remember at one meeting, one chap saying, look, what you have to do is you have to use quite a lot of that money to set up systems that allow you to manage that. Part of that is having not a supervisory system, but a kind of keeping an eye on people. And he said, I'm not going to beat about the bush. There is only one group of people who can do this, and that's women. It has to be women, because they're the ones, men won't pick up on the cues. So this is, your job is simply to sort of ring round everybody now and again and sort of say, how are you doing? Everything, going all right. He says, women will pick up mysteriously, because he was a bloke too, mysteriously somehow women know when somebody isn't quite right. They're not phoning in as often as they used to. When you phone them, you're not getting the same vibes back. And you've got to be able to pick that up so that you can do something about it. Because if once they're into that mode, it's downhill very quickly, and they'll fall apart and you'll lose them. And the other thing is, you have to create regular social get-togethers. And the last thing you must ever do at those, in other words, you must go and hire a castle in Scotland and take everybody up there. And you must not mention work, right? You've just got to create things, that engage people, dancing and singing and partying. Well, not partying, but, big feasts and things like that, or cultural activities, to create this sense of belonging and knowing each other, because otherwise it doesn't work. And within less than a decade, everybody was back in work. It didn't work. And so the other nice example I had, there's another meeting I was at, and some people from Unilever were explaining the process they'd gone through trying to, Unilever's headquarters, they had 3 headquarters campuses, 30 miles apart on a triangle. And I thought, this is stupid. this is a big footprint. So we will merge these three onto a new site and then sell off the land, right? So they built this purpose-built site. They thought about it very, very carefully. They talked people through it for a year before they actually got there. Again, here's the laptop, go and work at home, hot desking when you get in, only come in when you need to for a meeting, no managers' offices, all open plan. When you come in, we're going to make the environment very congenial for you. There's going to be a Michelin star restaurant there. There's going to be boutique shops and a gym and all these kind of things to make your life pleasant. And I thought the people we're going to have real trouble with are the old people, i.e. more senior people, because they're going to say, what about my 6-inch pile carpet and my 15 secretaries at my beck and call, my drinks cabinet in the corner? And the ones who would jump at it would be the youngsters, the 20-something graduates. And it was complete. They were absolutely astounded and completely side-swiped because it was the other way around. All the old folk went, whoopee, I can have a game of golf at lunchtime. I can take the kids to school, all these kind of things. But of course, they got embedded home social networks by them.
That's it. And the young people are going there to find it.
That was exactly the response to the young people. They said,
Yes.
what do you mean not come into work? We come into work to see our friends. That is our social world.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes. My worry about this is the younger cohorts are the ones that are actually going to look at this thinking it's a good idea and then suffer badly. And that needs to be thought about. But my suspicion is it's not going to stay the course of time, because people find it important to talk to each other face to face when they're trying to work problems out, whatever that problem might be, whether it's a design thing or administrative thing or what have you. They do it much better face to face. And this came out very nicely. We published one paper on it. Microsoft published another paper on it. And these essentially show different data sets. Like Microsoft's paper was looking at their entire workforce in the US, 60,000 people or some silly number. And they looked at the email traffic before and during lockdown. And what happened with the email traffic was the email traffic to the work group, and we showed the same with data from MIT in Cambridge, Mass, the university, again, looking at the entire academic email trails. Your email frequencies with the people, your work group or research group in that case, remain constant. What dropped off dramatically was emails to other people, spontaneous, casual, serendipitous contacts, which were created largely out of face-to-face meetings. And so you were not talking to new people, you're only talking to old people. So that's reducing the opportunity for new ideas to come into work groups. Secondarily, people were spending much more time online than they had ever spent in face-to-face committees because they were worried about not being there. So the short answer, or the short lesson on this is, you can end up wasting a lot more time and getting much less done and getting much less flow of ideas around the system, which are the things that trigger new discoveries.
Those realizations, the ahas, from
exactly.
melting pots of ideas.
Yeah.
And I'd love to, you mentioned before about people calling up and like checking in, how are you? And is there kind of a reframing that's needed? Like, rather than managers, do we need coaches? So the managers, rather than like looking over, checking what you've been doing, the coaches like looking to kind of build and see what tools and resources you need to be able to do your work in a better way.
That's an interesting idea. The answer may well be yes, in some sense, that because part of the problem is we're not, on the whole, most of us, very good at managing anyway. And people get put into management positions because they've been good at something else. Right.
Like who
So
likes managing? Who likes managing people? I had a PR agency for a few years. I didn't really enjoy I much prefer working side by side with people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the the object lesson here we keep coming back to in the book, which is simply called The Social Brain, the psychology of successful organizations, or something like that, is Gore-Tex, W.L. Gore, the company W.L. Gore that make Gore-Tex. Because right from the start, when they set up, Bill Gore, having worked for DuPont's, the big American chemical giant, and comes to the conclusion that these big multinationals are dysfunctional. Because what happens is rivalries grow up between different silos within the organization. They don't collaborate. Information doesn't get passed on, all sorts of things like that. He decided the problem was their size, and that there was an optimal size for managing relationships. And he came to down to the figure of 150. So to this day, all their factory units only have 150 people. They've upped it a bit, but the limit is now 200 and no more. Absolutely, it's very strict. Buildings are never more than 2 stories, ground floor and first floor, in order to facilitate personal relationships and ease of access. So you don't have to climb up lots of steps to go and see somebody. The result of that is, so it's a hugely successful medium-sized company, hugely successful. We're all wearing Gore-Tex somewhere. Even the astronauts had Gore-Tex in their, on the moon, had a Gore-Tex in their spacesuits. As they expanded, I mean, he literally started in his backyard, set this company up when he invented the product. And then as they've expanded, they rather than build a bigger factory, which is what everybody else does, they would build a new factory, often literally on the parking lot next door. Each factory is completely self-contained. Of course, the board gives them their targets, but then after that, everything's up to the individual factories to do this. So it's what they call their flat lattice management structure rather than a hierarchical one. Because they keep the numbers small, everybody knows who everybody is. And so nobody has actual labels, right? So the only thing you have on your jacket name badge just says Gore-Tex Associate.
Brilliant.
Because everybody knows who the factory manager is. Everybody knows who the accountant is. Everybody knows who's the sales team. Everybody knows who sweeps the floor. Everybody knows who pulls the levers to produce the stuff. Everybody knows who makes the sandwiches, personally. And therefore they work much, much more effectively together. And so long as the board is kind of directing and say, okay, you need to target this market, or we need to target this market, you need to produce for that. Then because they work together and collaborate together, they hit their targets. You don't need to do anything else. They don't need to incentivize them. They just enjoy being a little community.
So it sounds like they went completely the opposite way to what Unilever did, trying to then bring them all into one hub.
Yes.
Like, no, you've already got it right.
Yes, in one sense, but I think their hubs are already very big. That was the problem, because Unilever is a huge organization. I mean, it's an interesting company because it's a dual national company. It's jointly owned by the UK and the Dutch. That's why the Uni bit came in. The Lever bit is the original founder, William Lever, who invented margarine, basically, right? But somehow they teamed up with the Dutch over margarine and amalgamated these two companies. So who are the big Dutch margarine company? God, we used to eat it in Africa, like big tins.
All I can think is Flora.
Long before Flora. But because they started with also margarine and soap. That was the two things they made there. money on. And then when they amalgamated with the Dutch margarine makers, they became effectively, well, due course, Unilever to reflect that. But it's jointly owned. The headquarters are here. They were going to move it to Amsterdam about 2 years ago, and there was such uproar that they decided they better not, because they can have their headquarters in either country, really, just by tradition. It's always been here, and they thought they'd move it to Amsterdam, but probably for the benefits of the European market. But they didn't really need to, actually, because half the company is already in the EU still, so it wasn't really an issue. I suspect, actually, it was much more likely to be an attempt to prevent the company being taken over by predators, because the Dutch have very strict laws on foreign companies buying Dutch companies. Yeah, very strict, and it can't be done. So it might well have been an attempt to protect their existence, but somebody should think of that here.
And in Canada, I think here, it just, as soon as your tech business in particular takes off, you're just waiting for an American company to buy you.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly so. Yeah. I mean, this is, it's free trade, and we invented free trade, I'm afraid. So, the question is, has free trade outlived its use in that sense? Because it's all very well, and it does, in some sense, often lead to greater efficiencies, but it also leads to the destruction of whole industries.
Right.
Very, very quickly. This was the problem with Hershey's buying Cadbury's. They had to promise not to break Cadbury's up as a major competitor, but to keep it going. It's not entirely clear that they've stuck to their word. My
grandfather was a Cadbury's man.
Yeah, well, people who work for Cadbury's were what the Japanese would call company people, a company man. You were part of the family. And again, they were Quakers. They built, the Selly Oak estate for their workers.
The last thing I just want to mention is, so my last interview was with Richard Bartlett. So he was talking about, he's been working with your Dunbar's number for many years in terms of teams, and he talks about scale and rhythm.
Right. Yes.
So I think we've spoken quite a lot about this, and I find it very intriguing to think about organizations operating in this way and being very strategic about scale.
Yes.
And then rhythm, I guess that's coming into the new way of working in terms of remote working and having rhythm.
It's all about the bonding process, really. That's where the rhythm comes in. It's creating that sense of, because it doesn't come for free. Just by getting the right numbers doesn't mean to say
you need the rhythm, and intentional rhythm.
Yeah. So it's back to how small children see friends. They think if they say, Jimmy's my friend, that makes Jimmy my friend. But if you ask Jimmy, are you friends with so-and-so? No. All right. So it's the same in numbers. I mean, that you get the numbers right is really crucial, but you have to do something to make the people in those numbers gel with each other. It doesn't happen automatically.
And you don't necessarily need to say it out loud, but through your behaviors and activities, let them see that they are on your page, they're on your paper.
Yes, exactly. Exactly so. So it's about seeing the community as a community, and about belonging. And to create that sense of belonging requires rhythm, literally in many cases, because it requires a sense of doing things like singing and dancing together.
Yes.
If you want to
moving together.
Moving together.
And you mentioned your book, The Social Brain.
Yep.
Are there any other resources that you would like to recommend, given the topics we've spoken about, that you would like to direct people to?
So the other book is my friend's book, which is the one, actually it was two before, because that has, if you like, the friend's book summarizes the theory, but in a readable way. And the social brain business book applies the theory
Into the corporate
world.
Yeah. Yes, amazing. Thank you so much for the gift of your time today, Robin. I really, really appreciate you jumping on.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope this won't be the last time that I get to speak to you. I hope that this will be something that I come back to and kind of share where I get to in my research, and hopefully on my mission to find scalable, accessible solutions to loneliness.
Well, we should be interested to hear about them if you, this is the nirvana that we're all trying to achieve.